All right. So everyone, what I'm going to do is give us a few housekeeping items before we dig into the meat of the webinar. Today, we'll be focusing on the cool stuff happening around compliance in GitLab. As always, it's an interactive session, so people should jump in at any time. The housekeeping, I'm going to do a couple of multiple screen shares here. So the OpenChain project has a busy quarter 3 and quarter 4 lined up. And I've published an article explaining what we can expect in Q3 and beyond. The main stuff is that we will be completing the ISO balloting process on September 22nd. So September 23rd is the final day when everything is done. And after that, unless we have specific extra comments, OpenChain will be published as a formal international standard via ISO. So that's quite an important step for us, and that's something we've been working on for over a year. Once we're in ISO standard, it'll be much easier for sales and procurement departments to implement the OpenChain standard. Some of the expectations here. You will always be able to access the OpenChain standard through the OpenChain website. So we're going to be hosting precisely the same document as ISO. If you get it off our website, it's free access. If you get it off ISO, you'll have to pay their publication fee. But either one will be exactly what the ISO standard is. You'll always be able to self-certify to the ISO standard on the OpenChain website and all future versions of the OpenChain standard. We're going to make sure that you have exactly the same access as you did before. All of the work on developing the standard will remain right here. Same processes, nothing will change on that respect. We have nice, solid work teams and a good process workflow in place. You can expect stability. We're already discussing ideas and contributions for the next version of the standard, but we have no intention of iterating the standard in the near term. What will be published by ISO, you can expect to be in market for many years. We're going to make sure that there's a lot of stability around here. At the same time, we will continue our editing. Our goal is to make sure that as we get global feedback, we can incorporate that. A lot of the feedback we'll address just by having information, explaining to people what we really meant. But sometimes we'll have feedback that requires us to edit and prepare a future version of the standard. We don't plan to launch it soon, but we will make sure the framework for feedback is in place from the early part. What I'm doing right now is I'm going to just paste into the chat the link to this page, but this page will be going all over social media and so on soon, so it will be very visible. A couple more exciting things. One is that Siemens Healthineers announced OpenChain conformance. That's the first major medical company to be OpenChain conformant. Of course, Siemens has been part of the OpenChain board for ages. Siemens Healthineers is a separate company, and their conformance announcement will be very useful for us to go deeper and deeper into the medical sector, which is, it's greenfield, it's exciting new stuff. Also exciting, we have welcomed BMW Car IT, the software side of BMW, as the latest OpenChain Platinum member. That means they're joining our board alongside Toyota, and they will be providing a lot of support as OpenChain goes out as an ISO standard. So that's kind of generally the project updates. In short, we're having a lot of cool stuff happen, and we expect to continue doing cool stuff in the months ahead. But on to the webinar, the meat of our subject. So for those of you who are dialing in for the first time, this webinar is part of our bi-weekly series. We're doing this to help people hear talks and meet speakers that they would meet at conferences around the world. Today, we're going to be talking about compliance at GitLab. And what's interesting is that we got this topic in play due to a Twitter conversation. So I think I sent a tweet like in 2018 And I suddenly got a kind of tweet back from Mo sharing some really amazing links. And I said to him, oh, okay, can you do a webinar? And he was like, sure. And that's how this happened. Mo, welcome very much. And thank you so much for coming to speak a little bit about compliance at GitLab.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me, Shane. And I appreciate how it did actually sort of serendipitously come together, and that we are meeting for the very first time live here at on this webinar.
I know, it's crazy. Do you want to share your screen or just walk through? Okay, I'll end my screen share so you can share yours.
So I didn't put together a formal presentation here. What I thought I would do is sort of take advantage of the Q&A style of this webinar by going over some of the features, just sort of giving you a high-level overview of what we're doing right now in license compliance at GitLab. But first, I'll just start. So hi, my name is Mo Khan. I'm a senior engineer on the composition analysis team at GitLab. And for the last year, I have been working predominantly on improving our license compliance. So what that means is, as you host your projects on GitLab source control, you have the option to actually have our license compliance software scan your project and attempt to detect the different types of dependencies, versions of those dependencies, and software licenses associated with those dependencies, and to ultimately enforce a compliance policy for your project or organization. So if that works for you, Shane, I mean, we can meet this sort of a conversational style. I can walk through the documentation and then sort of give you like a high level overview of where does this code live and what does it look like in the context of
that would be super awesome. I mean, one opening question, and this is just for context. We have an active tooling work group, which is Thomas Steenbergen is on the line. He's deeply involved in the reference tooling work group and is a key person in the ORT open source review toolkit. So there's lots of discussion about tooling, automation, and so on. And one thing that happens in the background, people sometimes bring this up, and I don't know how this applies to GitLab as it applies to GitHub. There's that feeling that sometimes developers throw code onto repositories, maybe skip licensing altogether, and you know, there's potential for a terrible mess. So I'm guessing this is how you framed it to try to bring them in to a sensible approach, right?
I don't know if I've done a great job of trying to bring them in. If anything, we're trying to create more visibility, so there's better opportunity for developers to take more concern in these sorts of things, rather than you know, compliance in many circles can be sort of have negative connotations associated with it. So if we can surface it in such a way that isn't invasive, intrusive, and we can actually highlight some of these issues before they become issues earlier in the developer cycle, then maybe, you know, we will start to spend more time thinking about these things when we add a dependency. So let me go through this, because like one of the places that we try to hook into is actually the merge request cycle. So I'll give you an overview. The overview, for the most part, is you can see this is actually a screenshot from a merge request. So in the context of a developer workflow, as you're adding new code or adding new dependencies to your project, we're making some assumptions that you have some level of code review process. And at GitLab, we have merge requests to help facilitate those code reviews. And if you've enabled this feature, the license compliance feature in GitLab, you can actually detect the licenses that are being introduced as part of a new change or addition of new software. And so you can see in the screenshot here, we can say, okay, we're adding a new license. In this case, it's a MIT license, which is an interesting example as a license that we're trying to prevent from introducing into our software project. And then we've also applied a few other policies for different types of licenses. Now, there's a few things that we still have lots of room for improvement. So as I'm looking at this screenshot, I'm realizing, okay, well, this is an example of the SPDX license expression. So it represents multiple licenses, not just one. So it's a combination of both the BSD3 license plus or GPL2. But our goal is to be able to identify these as early as possible. So I'm going to just jump into where most of the code actually lives. So if you go to gitlab.com/gitlab.org, this is a public repository, and you can see all the work that's being done if you want to follow along. And this is the actual code that sits behind our license scanning technology. For the most part, we're leveraging other open source tools, and we're delegating to the native package managers to help facilitate this. So we're going to actually use the license compliance feature here to demonstrate how to use it in the license management code. If you go to a project with license compliance enabled, you'll see a few different tabs here. The one that I'm most interested in is the security and compliance tab. And so this is where you can actually get a list of all the dependencies that are currently part of your project, or dependencies that may be introduced into your project as part of the merge request. So let's just jump into license compliance. So you can see in this particular project, we have, we've identified master as what we're calling the default branch. And in the default branch, we have these dependencies already installed and approved and being shipped as part of the project. And these are the software licenses that are associated with these dependencies. On top of that, you have the opportunity to go ahead and apply your own policies to prevent or to allow specific licenses from entering your code base. So in this case, we have a set of licenses that are either allowed or denied. At the moment, you have to do this per project, but there are some issues and discussions about doing this at an organization level or a group level so that we can cascade these policies across projects. But right now, it is project to project. So if we go to an example, I'm going to go look at a merge request. So if you're a developer and you'd say you wanted to make a code change. So this is actually a merge request I'm currently working on. In this case, I'm not actually introducing any new licenses, but you can see I'm making some changes to the code. I'm not adding any new additions at this point, so I'm just going through my regular developer workflow. But as part of the merge request, there's actually a tab that will light up when the pipeline is completed. In this case, you can see it's still running. So we're still in the process of identifying what dependencies and licenses are associated. And once this completes, you'll see a license management or a license scanning widget show up with the list of licenses. So let's go back to an example of a merge request that has already completed. So let's go to this one. This is an older one. And if we look, we'll see there's actually a couple of widgets that are loading. The one that I want to zero in on is the license compliance widget. So in this case, we can see as per the code changes associated with this change request to be merged into the default branch, we've identified that no new licenses were introduced by the addition of new dependencies. If we dive in deeper, we can actually see if we are indeed adding a new dependency that happens to have a software license associated with it that violates our software license policy, we can catch that at the merge request review level. So it becomes a little bit more proactive than reactive. So instead of building reports to identify what is our current state and are we in compliance or out of compliance, we attempt to bring that sort of further into the pipeline or earlier or shift left into the pipeline so you can see it as soon as the dependency is about to be introduced into the supply chain. And from here, we can drill down a little bit further. We can see here are the existing licenses that we've actually detected as per this code change. So nothing new. The ones that we do have currently are already approved. And then there's a couple that are uncategorized at the moment. Now, we're constantly trying to improve our detection. This is an area that's, that is actually a lot of fun to work in. But we're also trying to source the known licenses that we have from the SPDX catalog so that we're sort of staying in touch with other open standards and list of, or bill of material lists that are out there. So I didn't know much about OpenChain. In fact, I still have lots to learn. That's why I'm partially here to learn and share. And I hope that this sort of gives you an idea of what we're trying to do with license compliance at GitLab. So I'm going to pause and just let you ask some questions or ask me if you want to dive in any deeper.
If it's okay, I'll start with the first one. So mine is the contrarian question. How do you break this process? How do you mess it up? And I'm asking that because I'm sure that sometimes people do, and I was wondering if there are some general hints and tips to avoid getting lost in trying to adopt your best practices.
I think part of it is when you're being retroactive about like deciding what policies to apply to your projects. So let's say that we do already have an existing project and we decided that we want to now go and apply policies to the project. It can be first difficult to identify, okay, where are we in terms of compliance today? So what is our current inventory of dependencies or bill of materials that we currently have in a project, and where do we stand from a license perspective. So being sort of mindful of that ahead of time will save us from having to replace or remove or adjust software license or dependencies that may have licenses associated that could put us out of compliance. So starting from here, like right in the policies page before you even have a project going, is a great place to start thinking about, okay, what licenses do I deem safe to use initially, and or even just starting with what licenses do I want to prevent from entering immediately, because it puts my organization out of compliance given the type of software that we ship. So yeah, I don't know if I could really answer that, Shane, because
No, I think you did. I mean, it sounds to me like the place where a lot of people fall down would be they're using stuff that's incompatible. And essentially one of your first steps is to highlight that, and you can see, oops, a daisy.
Yes. So I guess its starting point is to know where you're at in terms of compliance. And then one of the areas that I think is important to be mindful of is also getting some education on what are the common licenses that are out there and what are the obligations associated with that. So I will admit that GitLab right now, we don't do a great job of like highlighting what are the obligations of this. We sort of redirect you to external web pages to sort of help aggregate and collect that information. This is an area where we could improve, where we could actually show you this is like the obligations that are associated with this license and what that means for you and your organization. So, you know, I'd love to get more feedback, and our issue tracker is open. So if these are things that are people interested in, it's hard to prioritize this work or get buy-in from product to do this work unless there's people advocating or requesting it. So I encourage you to jump onto the GitLab issue tracker and just give it a search. If it's not there, open one up, and I'll probably be involved in the discussion in some capacity to help show that this is important to those that are out there. And if you need more info, you can ping me directly and I can help you get started.
To be honest, I'm surprised. It's like a lot of the CI/CD stuff you need seems to come for free utilizing GitLab, which is a pretty big thing to have on the table.
Yep. Yep.
I'd be curious to get some other perspectives on automation. Thomas, I was wondering if you might have something to note or say because of your experience around org.
Yeah, sure. I'm a little bit sleepy yet. It's like 2 a.m. at night, but
No, what are you doing?
well, conveniently, I saw one of your many emails. And I was like, well, let's look at it. So actually, I'm currently working on integrating Open Source Toolkit into GitLab.
Okay.
We're not going to use any of GitLab's built-in features because, unfortunately, they simply don't work for our use cases. There are many the checks that GitLab currently provides are not useful for the average company, basically.
Okay.
But it's basically.
I'd love to learn more about that if you're willing to share.
Yeah. Well, I commented on the ticket. Actually, if you look at the, I can send you the link if you want to have it. I actually commented because we are a GitLab customer.
Okay.
And I actually explained that so I work on the tooling side on. I sent the link inside of the chat if you want to find a direct link.
Oh, thank you.
Just for context, Thomas is with Here Technologies, so automotive space and mapping, all that very cool stuff.
And so I have many different hats on. So I work on the SPX standard, for instance, and I work on I work on our own tooling, so Open Source Toolkit. I also, whenever I have time, I like to contribute to OpenChain as well, whenever I can to improve it. And so actually, I wrote a big long piece on the topic. If you search in this ticket, you go down in one of the comments. I actually commented on what works and what doesn't work. Looking from reaching out an open arm basically from the open source community that's working on tooling, so that actually there's a growing community of open source tools that have come together to basically work on the area of license compliance.
Yep.
And so I try to explain like what we do, what works and what doesn't work, and and especially, so there's a couple of things that basically we would love to collaborate on, and there's a couple of things that deliberately means why, as a company, we would never can't use your tools, and try to explain, like, hey, this is what it means to do license compliance, and this is there. So yeah, that's why I got up at 2 a.m. to hopefully talk again with our customer.
Thank you, Thomas.
To
Okay,
say,
I've
like,
got some
hey,
reading to do.
hello from the other side, from Berlin. This is why a lot of your customers don't use this, because we have basically legal requirements that are not met, and also contractual requirements. And to basically say, like, hey, we'd love to collaborate. Again, I'm just one of a big group of us in Germany. I'm probably the only one crazy enough to get up at 2 a.m.
Thank you,
That's
Thomas, for
fair.
doing so. It sounds like you've got a wealth of knowledge and experience that I can lean on. Thomas, I don't know if it's possible for me to. I'm going to read this issue, and then I'll follow up on it from there and see if there's more that we can do to better utilize the open source tooling and knowledge that's out there. I apologize that our tooling currently doesn't meet your needs. I hope that I can somehow do the work necessary to convince you that one day it is usable. And I appreciate the write-up, and I'll take the time to read through this and get better.
So what we love to do is, from all the other projects, is have like another project which to bring in. So GitLab, or for the people that are familiar, have this direction of bring your own tool.
Yep.
So it's currently only for security tools, as far as I understand. So, and like, we would love to have the same for license compliance tools, of basically opening up the API. So just for people on the call that are not familiar with it, so bring your own tools is basically, so GitLab realizes that they cannot serve every need basically under the sun. So basically what they did is they are kind of like opening up the door, so you can take your own tool and basically run it inside of GitLab, and then kind of like plug in. Because as we had previous calls also on OpenChain, on the tooling group, like, there's not one silver bullet tool that serves all use cases under the sun. Basically, different companies have different processes, have different business needs. So as such, you have a wide variety of tools for depending on what you're taking. So GitLab realizes, at least from the security side, they have this bring your own tool, where you can basically, the idea is that you take your tool that you have identified fitting your needs, and you then basically plug it into GitLab, and you then integrate it. So I don't think, correct, it doesn't same as on the license compliance side, right? That's different.
That's right. We do publish like the report format that's necessary for bring your own tools for the security scanners. But we haven't actually published the report format for license scanning. With that said, it is possible to build your own tool and export a license compliant report. It's not published at the moment. So that is an area that we need to improve on.
Yes, so that was one of the things I was trying to reverse engineer actually this weekend, to figure out what the heck the format is.
Okay, well, let me see if I can help you with that part at least. There is a schema, and it isn't published, but at least we do have a JSON schema. So if you go to the license compliance repo, spec, let's take a look here, fixtures, schemas. So we do have the schemas for the different versions of the report. 2.1 is probably the one you're going to want to target. And at least this will get you going. You still have to export the report as a license scanning artifact. There's been a rename in the last few months. You may see some documentation refer to it as license management, but the most up-to-date should be license scanning. So it's undocumented. I'm not sure at what point, if we are going to make it public or if we're going to solidify on this, but the security reports, that is a published format, and that is meant to be made useful in the bring your own tools space. So if there's a need for this, and if you prefer to have this published as a standard, we can start an issue and start talking about that, because I'd be happy to make that available and also publish that if there's interest.
So both from the Fossology, which is another open source tool, they basically, we both integrate into GitLab. So we're working on it. They already are a little bit ahead of us. So yeah, this would be for open source tools. One of the things that we would love to have is just publish, to basically say, like, hey, if you create a file with this format, then basically it will automatically insert basically straight into GitLab.
Yep. at the moment, this is the public published version, is the schema right here. So if you can adhere to that, there are a few examples in here that you can look at to get started. So as part of the fixtures expected, and feel free to email me if you want more guidance in this. So let's take a look at how about Ruby version 2.1. So this is the license compliance or license scanning report that is produced today. So we try to identify the SPDX identifier that's associated with the software, and we group that together in the licenses section. And then we've got a list of dependencies with some very rudimentary information, the source of like where we identified the dependency, the SPDX identifiers for the dependencies and version, etc. So in terms of actually adhering or producing a report that matches the schema, I'm sure that's well within any of the individual's grasps here. It's just we don't publish the public documentation on it, but it is doable today.
This is great. We'll easily write this. This is not a problem.
Yeah. Great.
One of the things I thought was really heartening is essentially it looks like you have first principle support for SPDX, license identifiers and so on.
Yeah, this was sort of important to me. I joined GitLab in July of last year, so it's just been a year for me. And when I first joined, the detection was based on name. And one of the first things I noticed is like you will see name, let's say, for example, MIT can be represented in so many different ways, MIT license, MIT with lowercase. And so we were seeing, and this is still a problem, which I think we need to make better, was that we identify the same logical license, but report it as like different licenses. And so in the last year, I mean, it's taken some work to at least introduce the concept of the SPDX catalog. So today, when we still leverage License Finder to do the detection, we attempt to canonicalize that license that's identified by matching it with an identifier from SPDX. And that has its own issues as well, because in some cases, some of the licenses are now deprecated from the SPDX catalog. So identifying like, okay, how do we migrate this old data? But having a canonical identifier for a license, I think just knowing that SPDX was out there was a huge win, because having to have an internal representation for what the MIT license is versus an industry standard, it just made sense to try to adopt something like SPDX. So there is work right now to better integrate with SPDX. We have a cron job that runs weekly that attempts to pull down the latest version of the SPDX catalog and at least keep in sync with that in the back end of the Rails application. And so as we're identifying licenses in the scan reports and we're publishing that up, you have an opportunity to at least do the matches based on identifier, the SPDX identifier, rather than just name alone. We still fall back to name for some of the older installations. We try to maintain some level of backwards compatibility there, but there's still lots of room for improvement, and I think, from what I quickly saw there, Thomas, you even mentioned it, the with exception clauses, the or, and here it is. And so we don't actually parse the SPDX standard expressions today. I will say that there is a project that is working on addressing that. Let me see if I can find it now. GitHub.com/spandex. Spandex that at least tries to take the ABNF for the expression syntax and convert that into a parsable like grammar so that we can make sense of it. And but it hasn't been integrated yet. So this is still things that need to be improved upon. So this is actually taking the ABNF directly from the 2.1 spec so that we can parse it. We can intelligently understand whether it's a license with a composite license with an or, and then with exceptions, but we don't have a semantic way to understand that in the Rails side of the world yet. So given there's enough people who are sort of pushing for this and asking for this, then there might be room to actually improve that. But I love the SPDX standard. They clearly document what are the expressions. I'm starting to see the identifiers for SPDX emerge in a lot more open source code. And it's nice to just have a canonical identifier to represent a single bill of material or software license. So I think you said, Thomas, you're working in that group. I'm not sure exactly how or where, but thank you, because
I'm one of the core maintainers, yes.
Okay. So yeah, we source our information from at least the JSON document. I know there's like the several different RDF formats in there. It's even got the license text, the bodies. So in terms of our own detection, I want to improve our quality of text detection, which we spent no time doing in the time that I'm here so far. But the catalog maintains like a more than enough information to at least maintain some level of like Bayesian classifier, so we can improve that. And there's lots of open source tools that already do that, as you pointed out. So lots of room for improvement. And I apologize it doesn't meet your need, Thomas, and I'm working really hard to make this better. So if you want to point me in the right direction, I'm more than happy to listen. And
we can have a follow-up call, and I can explain you what, why, and how, and
I would love that.
what we're building.
I would love that.
I said we're as I wrote in the very last, we're currently implementing as a company, we're implementing our open source toolkit into GitLab itself, because we are a GitLab customer.
Yep.
And yeah, I had to do lots of explaining, and I'm still explaining to people. And I'm like, hey, we built license compliance from GitLab. We can use that. And then I was like, no, we can't.
It's severely lacking at the moment. Yeah, and it needs
and then
work.
I have to explain it.
Yeah.
And what for me was unclear is where you are on the roadmap, because I see tons of security features coming in, and license management is still behind, basically, like that. So yeah, we now opting to use the security tools and not use the license compliance tools. Yeah, I don't know if it's of interest to people on the call. I know I see Thomas and other stuff to explain why that is. I wrote and I shared it in the chat already. The link to the topic, which contains only a brief summary of, well, it's already a long bit, but it's already one A4 page of the technical details on how, what, and why. The hint is, if I would give a hint, is that, and it happens with a lot of tools, is how you get the data. So there's like 3 things that you basically have to do for license compliance. 1 is to detect your dependencies. 2 is to check basically to check the dependencies. You check the source code. And 3 is basically write a policy on it. Now, one of the things inside, there's various things that go wrong here, and common mistakes that are being made. But one of the very trickiest things, and why we developed Open Source Toolkit, in Open Source Toolkit was specifically designed for the CI/CD scenario, is to do this at scale and at speed. So you have to understand that if you basically do this in CI/CD, so when you're continuously building code, you kind of have like a budget of, what do you say, like 10, 15 minutes for like your merge request review. That's basically, that's how much time you kind of have. So for your developer to basically do license compliance, you have the overall budget to do all of the building and the testing. So not just license compliance, but to actually build the code, run all of the tests and all the stuff, is about 10 to 15 minutes. That's kind of the sweet spot for most developers. And
that's quite a long time for some developers. Right?
Yeah, that is quite a long time. Now, then you have to imagine that if you run, for instance, a license scan, so actually a proper scan, so just like the way, for instance, what GitLab does is they only look on the declared license of the package. But from a legal perspective, you have to actually look what is actually licensed in the source code of the package. So you have to actually scan the source code of everything that's in there, which can be, well, an NPM project, it can be thousands of dependencies. And you have basically maybe 2 minutes or 3 minutes to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the challenge thing to do, basically license compliance. You have to do things at scale, at speed, and not drop the level of compliance that basically you're required to comply to licensing. So that's the insanely, from an engineering perspective, it's insanely complicated puzzle to fix.
Absolutely.
To figure things out.
And I think that's why it makes it so fun. If there's so many interesting like technical problems in just what you just said, that 2 minutes to resolve. And there's many different ways to look at solving that problem or sets of problems, which is why I think it's a fascinating space. And hopefully I get more time to work on that.
So yeah, we've been now working on it for since we started in late 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And so
2015, 5 years. So that was with the open source toolkit and with SPDX? Or okay.
Yep. So yeah, we started basically. So OpenSource Toolkit has been open sourced in 2017, but basically that's kind of the well, the second iteration, because the version was an internal one, and so we open sourced it. It's a Linux Foundation project, and yeah, to basically get that done and to do it actually
At scale.
at scale, at speed, and to automate the complexity. So I said you have allow and deny lists, and that's basically not sufficient for what you need, because there's lots more complicated cases that I try to explain. So in the real world, you might have an open source project that basically uses a GPL for, say, it's building the code, but the actual code is under MIT. So then you have to write rules that basically say, like, again, hypothetically speaking, you may be a company, hypothetically speaking, that says we do not allow GPL licenses, but we do allow them for, say, if they happen on the build code or the test code. So if they are not happening inside of the code that's actually being used into our product. So then you have to write code. So I don't know how people familiar with that, but there is the SBS list, which is about 400 licenses. But if you count all the other open source licenses, all the permutations, you easily get to like 6,000 open source licenses out there. Because humans are very creative in in writing new licenses or redefining existing licenses.
So I'm curious to know, like, how did you identify that number?
This is a common in common industry number. So one of the big vendors, who name I shall not name, but is friendly, publishes this number. And actually, there is actually some open research from universities that have published lists of. There was somebody at some point crazy enough to try to see how much was out there and if they could connect all of them together, so that you can kind of see, like, how do the text of the licenses kind of relate between each other, and so, like, in how many open source licenses are like remnants of the MIT license, for instance. And they produced a whole list, because we have something called license proliferation, where people took a license and they're like, oh, I like MIT as a base starting point, but then I'm gonna make this my Shane Coonan license, and I'm gonna say, like, you can only use MIT if you're called Shane Coonan, and this is the new Shane Coonan license, which is basically like 99% MIT license, but then there was a one-liner added.
Wow.
So yeah, so what is now happening is basically a lot of large organizations, the companies, open source foundations, and all this stuff basically came together and basically said, like, we as the open source community created this mess. Let's build tools to see if we can work together to basically clean things up. So there we have, as I said, we have a whole range now, say, as OpenChain as basically the highest level process and spec standard of, like, hey, this is, as an organization, how you can be compliant. Then we have SPX in the data exchange. So how do you actually exchange between parties what two licenses are in my code? And then we have the OpenChain reference tooling working group, where we have dedicated tool calls, where basically we have on the tooling side, where there's various open source projects in this space. So we have Fossology already, that has been existing for long. We have Open Source Toolkit, which you're now showing. We also have, for instance, Stern for Docker compliance, which is a whole other nightmare on itself. And so yeah, basically we have all of these various projects basically coming together from all the various points, all trying to basically chisel at this very complex legal and technical issue to basically try to tackle this, basically. And so yeah, so it's basically from the community. You see this as my hand reaching out and say, we'd love to collaborate. Come join the party. There are some some people say crazy engineers and crazy lawyers trying to do the impossible.
Well, that's an interesting combination.
Yeah, so again, there's just so many interesting technical problems that are happening, and trying to fix it is just it's a long effort. So we're not trying to fix everything tomorrow because it's simply impossible. But yeah, we are trying to make on a community solution. So the whole way, if you look at the whole issue, is basically why did we get to the point we're there? Is basically, and why is it such a mess? Is basically there's no easy turnkey community solution to solve kind of what is basically a community problem. It's like we as an open source community, we created this problem, and there was no tooling apart from a lot of commercial tools. And what we're now trying to do is basically say like, hey, provide an array of, again, there's no silver bullet for any case, provide a whole array of open source tools, and then provide the documentation and the guidance to basically say like, hey, if this is your problem, then this is your tool, and this is how you can build a pipeline with this open source tool to fit your needs. And if needed, because again, we cannot cover everywhere, there we have some gaps where we fill in with, we have some commercial partnerships going on where we have done commercial vendors basically filling in gaps where there is currently no open source tool available. Because again, we need to get the job done, and the best way we do this. But
and so when you describe a pipeline, I'm interpreting this as the pipeline. So you've got these broken down as separate phases, and then in each phase, you can hook into whatever your tooling or organization specific needs are to alter the end behavior. Is that correct?
yeah, yes. So we basically, so kind of what's basically happening. So we're the OSPO, and so basically this is kind of talking to a lot of OSPOs across the world, and what is the generic pipeline? What do you want? And basically from the needs of the open source office, we started building. So basically what happened really is open source offices got so frustrated with not having tools that work for them that basically all of them started building their own. So I know several of them that basically built their own, and now basically all of them are like, we open source all of us, let's work together to basically cobble together a pipeline that does work for us.
Yep.
And again, our needs are not, well, again, like there's so many things that, well, there's some things that are unique to our company, but they're like 95% is just basically common, and basically we couldn't find a tool that fitted our needs, and everybody started building. So there's people that are working on the on UI bits. There's people that work deep inside the hood on like actual scanners. So like Filippo went from ScanCode, or Michael Jaeger in Fasolity. They're also working on like improving different scan technologies. So they're really deep down into the nitty gritty of doing license detection and all that other stuff. We are basically working on we're specifically focused on the CI/CD bit, and also on how to you make it so that it scales in your organization. So how do you do the integration that is user-friendly, that it all works, and that you can handle all of the crazy things that is there. So funny enough, each open source project that's kind of under the Linux Foundation has kind of like its own
way of
focus of area space on what they're trying to tackle this problem and do their own things. But
I suppose one thing that's worth pointing out is that the reference tooling work group meets bi-weekly, which is pretty high speed. And one of the aspirational outcomes is that we'll end up with some descriptions of reference toolkits. So people can know that, oh, I want to do X. Let's say I want to use GitLab, and what's available inside GitLab, what's available outside, how do they interoperate? And over time, we're hoping to make those guides. I'm just going to steal the screen for a second, but I'd like to go back to the screen in a minute. Okay, so I'm just going to show something on my end. So OpenChain is a really high-level standard, and we basically say do something at inbound, have training policy and process internally, and do something at outbound. And we identify those inflection points, but we don't say how to fill them out. What we do is provide lots of reference material, and automation is huge. And as Thomas said, a lot of the companies are collaborating on trying to describe what worked for them and then how it worked. So it's really a great moment in tooling. And what's important is that OpenChain will be an ISO standard soon. But we just had Open Source Summit North America, and in his keynote, Jim Zemlin announced that SPDX will also be an ISO standard soon. Now, I knew that. We're sister projects. But here's how it works. We've created this way to create ISO standards, and we're starting with the foundational context standards. So OpenChain to describe the process points where you should do something. SPDX as the software bill of materials, probably the largest global traction. So we're putting in place those big things, and then all the tooling hopefully will interoperate and utilize, let's say, SPDX and so on, which is why I was so glad that you've got SPDX at the heart of your work. That's great.
It's a start.
That's a big start. I mean, the tooling is, I think, really easy to understand. It looks like that process of beginning to use GitLab, an individual developer could pretty easily get started right there and see where they're at.
Yeah, as you know, as we've mentioned, there's lots of room for improvement, and I'm learning a lot with this space. So I guess, you know, I'm quite fortunate to be in this room with as much knowledge as there is to try to improve these things. And I'd love to be able to work with others in this call to see if we can bring some of that goodness to GitLab, the customers, and just the open source community. We can get some of this work merged back into GitLab core, so that, you know, as we mentioned at the start of the call, like if licenses can be something that's considered, you know, a positive thing, that when you're thinking about in terms of like adopting a dependency, it's not something that's an afterthought. And I don't think it's honestly that hard to actually think about it. It's just, it's time consuming, and right now there isn't a lot of tooling, or we're working on tooling to make that better.
Well, even the simple step that you're going to look at a dependency and it puts front and center what license that's under, and you see your own license. I mean, that's a big step forward from copy paste off Stack Exchange.
Yeah. Yes.
Which is where we're at right now. We had a few more cool people join the call. So we had Jeff join, and Jeff, of course, was in the tooling area forever. Jeff, I think you were working on tooling for over a decade, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. This is great to see. I've been sitting here with tears coming down my face just to see such engagement and I think love for licensing. Let's call it that. I started Palamita because I was just so frustrated with, you know, big companies not respecting open source and not having any way to do it. And at that time, the only way we could do it is with, you know, a commercial company. And I think it just shows how the network effect and the community that's built up around just, you know, getting companies to understand what they need to do and the importance of it. And it's just great to see. And I just want to say kudos to everybody working on this project. This looks great.
I think Palamita was pretty early to market. I mean, you guys, the first time I met you, we were in Palo Alto, and you were giving Armine Hamel a baseball cap.
Yeah.
He won swag.
We started in 2003 and kind of came out with a product in 2004 and spent about 16 years. You know, as I said, our best work was always under NDA. So behind the scenes, kind of helping people out the best we could. And it's just great to see it to kind of come out from the boardrooms and the general counsel's office to a public Zoom call with people joining and GitHub sites and GitLab sites. So just great to see.
We have a few more people from around the place, like for instance, Chris from Oppo also joined. Hey Chris, welcome on board. Kubota-san from Sony. So we've got a bunch in the audience. And you know, I think it reflects the fact that a lot of people are interested in seeing how this stuff works. Speaking of GitHub, do you know if they've got a similar system? And do you know if you guys could interoperate if people had, let's say, some repos here, some repos there?
I don't know what GitHub is doing in this space with compliance. They did some work years ago that I'm aware with, like the choose a license.org integration and being able to like choose a license when you're building a project. Their acquisition of Dependabot, it looks like with the Dependabot source code being open, and I've read a good chunk of it, they're not too far off from being able to do what GitLab's already doing, but I don't know what's happening other than that, than what I've seen from just reading code.
The Dependabot is an interesting thing. I'm on various GitHub repositories, and occasionally I get this email, and it's like, Dependabot fix X. And it's like, that's such a simple concept, but it makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think like the idea of like updating your packages as like a, brought to the forefront is important, right? And making it so that it's a natural part of software development and engineering is a bit of a change for some organizations where, if it works, they don't want to change the version of the package. But learning to adapt and change and build like change into the release cycle, I think is one of the things that Dependabot has done quite well, because they've surfaced it in the UI, they surfaced it with notifications. I don't know what the current experience is like, actually. I haven't used it recently, but it has the opposite effect where it can be overwhelming with too many notifications. And so you have to find that sweet spot, I think, where it's like you're being useful but not annoying. And with something like compliance and updating vulnerabilities and updating scan packages, we want security and convenience can be at odds, but providing that guidance, the necessary guidance, so that we're aiding you in your process of development versus being a blocker or an interrupt or time away from things that you could be accomplishing. And so finding that sweet spot, I think, is going to be difficult for any org, especially when you're doing it well. Like in the case of Dependabot, there's a lot of false positives too, where they will attempt to update and the build will break, right? Where the updates weren't as clean as they could have been. So there's room for improvement, I think, probably on the GitLab side and the Dependabot side, and this whole space, this whole industry.
I think you hit on something really important about that fidelity level, because if you go back, let's say, 10 years, a lot of people using Black Duck Protex got so many yellow marks. You had some green, it's fine, some red, it's bad, and then a sea of yellow. And it's like, how do I review this? I can imagine with a large project, but let's say Dependabot. I mean, I'm on small projects and I get hit a couple of times a week. It's like, oh, that's awesome. But imagine if you had 1,000 dependencies updating.
And then manage that.
Yeah.
And on a per project level, then if you step up a little bit further to having to manage an organization with multiple projects and making sure that having all of those projects in compliance or some level of compliance can be even more challenging with some of the manual steps that I think some organizations, or at least organizations that I've worked for, have had. One previous organization there was like a manual export process of the bill of materials information into the central repository, so you can identify what dependencies and licenses you currently had. But as we know, like any sort of manual action can quickly become out of sync with what's actually happening. And that sort of gap can cause, is where, real issues can emerge, especially in compliance. I'm sorry, Thomas, I think you were saying something?
Yeah, Dependabot is fun, especially if you're like me, you're the head of an OSPO, and you basically are the owner of a GitHub organization. You get a lot of Dependabot notifications.
Yeah, your notifications are almost frightening. You don't want to go there.
And it's Dependabot has some quirks. But most people, again, for most people, it's weird that I run an OSPO, but I'm deeply familiar with tooling into the deepest nitty gritty. Like for people that are not familiar with doing, like, what most people don't realize is that basically the development stack, how code is written, compliance, whether it was security or license compliance, is kind of as an afterthought. As engineers, we're happy that the code builds. Like that's already like an array. It builds. I got it to finally do what I wanted to do. And then you got all these other tools complaining about like this is wrong, or this is wrong. And so most of the build tools are not designed. This is why basically from a lot of companies, organizations are now working together to basically see, going back to say the package managers or the build tools, and basically make compliance like native, not to be clear, or make them more friendly to compliance. Like something simple as asking the build tool, what are the dependencies that are actually in you? So for instance, you take npm, for instance, you could npm has 6 different commands to give you the list of dependencies, and all of them are wrong.
What? What do you mean they're all wrong?
They're all incomplete.
Please elaborate.
So if you understand how NPM works and how it operates, and this is why we have a weird quirky implementation in ORT for NPM. NPM, the way how it was developed as an open source project, every developer came from a different point of view, basically trying to solve a particular, like, oh, I just want to, like, one thing was, I just want to have a printout on the terminal to see what are my dependencies.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That was one view case when you read the whole history, and there was one view case. And there was another one from like, oh, I want to know when there's updates available. So that was another view case where another command. So and
Right.
that was never kind of like harmonized into a nice model. But if you know how NPM works and the options that were later introduced, you can, for instance, introduce in NPM a direct inclusion directly to the Git repository. Right, so you just say in the dependencies, you say like this package is in this Git repository.
Yeah.
So if you do then a list command to print out the dependencies, that thing will not pop up. And so there's multiple cases where basically we are aware of through many years of learning that basically, yeah, that things are evolving in the open source community of tools being built and new use cases are being added to tools, but the keeping track of dependencies is really really complex. So just to give you an example of another community, so the Python community, right, and Python has been around for years, for decades. Only now they're working on a dependency resolver. So in Python, doing
built-in,
built in into the build tool. So again, Python has been around for 2 decades, something like that. Don't quote me on it, but very, very long. So Python, for people wondering why compliance for Python is really difficult, getting what is actually the dependencies in Python. So just asking Python, like, what are the dependencies of the project? There is no built-in tool from Python itself to do that. Like, it's not that you just say the build tool, run a command and give me the thing. It doesn't exist. They're still building it at this very moment. They started work in early January. So this is when all of the tools basically have to have very creative ways to figure out what the heck is actually in a Python project. And everybody's like, yeah, but Python is already like 2 decades old. Why isn't it solved? Well, actually, the community itself and the Python community never got around to do proper package management. Like they were doing so many other things that, yeah, they didn't get around. And so this happens quite often, that basically what is possible basically in building code, and then you need to do compliance for it, and then these worlds are at odds, and that's why like a lot of developers get frustrated because like, but I can make this Docker container. Why are you saying I cannot ship this container? Well, I can tell you, you can't do proper compliance for Docker containers because basically it's not inside of Docker. It simply doesn't exist inside when Docker was designed. Like when the engineers at Docker Inc. thought of Docker, they simply didn't think of compliance. It was not on the top of the mind.
It was an afterthought.
It was an afterthought. They were happy to get Docker to work in the first place.
The idea of just building a layer and having each layer, if you could just get through each of the layers and build an image that you can run in a container, that was quite the feat. So I know it's 2 a.m. for you there, Thomas. Is that what you said earlier?
It's 3 a.m. now.
It's 3 a.m. now, so it sounds like you could keep going. I'm curious to maybe one day have a chat with you about your thoughts around version constraints and dependency graphs and dependency resolution, because it seems like every package manager has their own way of representing constraints and doing their own way of resolution, but it seems like a very generic problem. In some ways, I kind of wish there was like a canonical format or intermediate language to describe version constraints. And I think that's a difficult thing to organize, but I'd love to chat with you about that if that's something you're interested in.
I guess one takeaway from this call is that globally, we're starting from a very low floor, right? I mean, most people.
Yeah,
so
any improvement is quite a bit of improvement at this point.
Any improvement is huge. And you know, for us, this is an example of the OpenChain self-certification questionnaire. We allow a huge amount of leeway in how people can fill out. So for instance, section 4, question 2, do you archive copies of your and people can do that in a whole host of ways. And that's fine. We're not planning to be prescriptive on that one. If someone's I'm just going to check.
I apologize. That was me. I was replying to Takashi-san. The question was, I'm sorry if I missed the context, but is the license compliance functionality what Mosan introduced available with Community Edition? And it isn't at this time. It is Enterprise Edition. I would love to get it into Community Edition because I think like the sooner you can get it into the free and open source Community Edition, the more we can sort of normalize these ideas around compliance as a first-class thing in software projects. If we put it behind like these pay gates of Enterprise Editions, it's going to be this enterprise problem still, and it really affects more than just enterprises. So I apologize at the moment it's not, but you have a champion inside GitLab that is working to change that.
Well, I mean, the fact that the item is in place gives quite a bit of positive hope. And, you know, if it's only available in Enterprise Edition, I think for a lot of our demographic, corporate demographic, that's not going to be an issue at this point in time. Though naturally, if it was freely available, that would be super awesome, especially for, you know, smaller suppliers. One of our worst nightmares globally is the, oh, I made a driver. What's in the driver? And, you know,
where did it come from?
Yeah, copy paste, change a little bit, and then they're like, "Oh, we can't give you our proprietary secret source code." And you're like, "Oh god, here we go again." And I suppose having this kind of tooling for scanning in place for the people using or GitLab, whatever people are using, it's a huge step up for us. So that's why OpenChain is very bullish about automation. We know we're not going to fix it manually. And we know that people can answer our questions in a very vague way, but answer them in a way that will be sustainable. It needs automation, replicability, it needs standards. And, you know, I'm really glad you came on today. And
yeah,
people are going to be super excited about the SPDX item. So a whole bunch of us here in Japan, we are working on SPDX for practical deployment. Companies like Fujitsu, Toshiba, Hitachi are already using SPDX. And what you've shown us has been pretty new. A lot of people ask, you know, is there tooling available? Is there enterprise tooling, CI/CD support on the compliance side? And I think this is the first time we've had a talk from not a non-vendor, but a service provider saying, yeah, we've integrated at the heart of it. Here's how it works. So thank you so much, Mo. That's very cool.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone. If you have any further questions, now's the time. If not, we will let everyone go to bed in Europe and everyone start in Asia. Okay, everyone. Thank you very much. Take care. Have a great week.